On a sweltering August morning in 1982, Raymond Cole maneuvered his red Coca-Cola delivery truck through the tree-lined streets of Alexandria, Virginia, balancing crates of glass bottles that clinked with each turn like a percussion section keeping time with his thoughts. The route was familiar, carved into his muscle memory after 7 years of pre-dawn deliveries to convenience stores, restaurants, and vending machine locations that dotted the Washington metropolitan area. He expected nothing more from this Thursday than the usual routine of unloading cases, restocking refrigerators, and collecting payments from Diane owners who greeted him by name. He had no reason to believe that a simple delivery to a small grocery store on Commonwealth Avenue would thrust him into the center of a Soviet espionage operation that had been running undetected for nearly 3 years. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Raymond Cole was 34 years old that summer, a solidly built man with broad shoulders earned from years of hauling beverage cases up and down stairs, loading docks and narrow store aisles. His hands bore the scars and calluses of manual labor, small cuts from broken glass, and the permanent tan lines from work gloves he wore during winter months. He had grown up in Richmond, the son of a postal worker and a seamstress, and he had taken the Coca-Cola job straight out of high school when college seemed financially impossible and the military held no appeal. The work was honest and steady, providing enough income to support his wife Linda and their 2 daughters in a modest house in Springfield with a small backyard where he grew tomatoes each summer and built a wooden swing set that his youngest still used. The delivery route Raymond worked covered a 40-square-mile territory that stretched from the affluent neighborhoods near Old Town Alexandria to the more modest commercial strips along Route 1. He knew his customers intimately, remembered their children's names, knew which store owners would try to negotiate better prices, and understood the rhythm of each location's inventory needs. Mrs. Kowalski at the Polish deli always needed extra cases before weekend barbecues. The Vietnamese restaurant on King Street went through twice as many bottles in summer when their patio opened. The convenience store near the metro station required daily restocking because of commuter traffic. This accumulated knowledge made Raymond efficient at his job, but it also made him exceptionally attuned to changes in pattern, to deviations from established routine. Petrov's Market had been added to Raymond's route 8 months earlier when the previous delivery driver retired and territories were redistributed among the remaining staff. The store occupied a narrow storefront between a dry cleaner and a shoe repair shop, its faded awning and hand-painted sign suggesting a business that had seen better days. The proprietor, Viktor Petrov, was a man in his late 50s with thinning gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that magnified his pale blue eyes. He spoke English with a thick Eastern European accent that Raymond initially assumed was Russian or possibly Polish, and he ran his store with meticulous attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. The shelves were always perfectly organized, the floor spotlessly clean, and inventory rotated with a precision that suggested someone who understood supply chain management far better than the typical small grocery store owner. Raymond's deliveries to Petrov's Market followed a consistent pattern. He would arrive between 7:15 and 7:30 in the morning, before the store opened to customers. Petrov would unlock the back door after Raymond knocked 3 times, a specific signal they had, established during the first delivery. Raymond would wheel his hand truck loaded with cases through the narrow storage room to the refrigerated display case in the main store, restock the shelves, collect payment in cash that Petrov counted out with methodical precision, and depart. The entire transaction rarely exceeded 20 minutes, and conversation was minimal beyond basic pleasantries about weather and business conditions. But on this particular Thursday morning, something was different. Raymond arrived at his usual time, knocked 3 times on the back door as established, and waited. No response. He knocked again, louder this time, and heard movement inside, but the door remained closed. After nearly 5 minutes, unusual enough to make Raymond check his watch twice, the door finally opened. But it was not Viktor Petrov who stood in the doorway. The man was younger, perhaps 35, with dark hair and a lean build that suggested regular physical training. He wore jeans and a plain, white t-shirt, and his expression carried none of the shopkeeper's customary friendliness. More striking was what Raymond glimpsed over the man's shoulder in the brief moment before he stepped aside to let Raymond enter. The storage room, which was normally immaculate and carefully organized, was in complete disarray. Boxes had been pulled from shelves and their contents spread across the floor. The small desk where Petrov kept his invoices and receipts stood open, papers scattered as though someone had been searching frantically for something specific. Raymond hesitated at the threshold, his instincts warning him that something was very wrong. "Where's Mr. Petrov?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral but firm. The younger man's expression remained flat. "He is not feeling well today. I am his nephew, Stefan. I will take the delivery." The explanation sounded plausible enough, but Raymond noticed several details that troubled him. The man's English, while accented, carried different, vocal patterns than Petrov's speech. His posture was too straight, too controlled, like someone with military training who couldn't quite shed the habits of parade ground discipline. Most tellingly, his eyes moved constantly, scanning Raymond's face and body language with an intensity that seemed calculated rather than casual. Raymond wheeled his hand truck into the storage room, moving carefully around the scattered boxes. As he worked, loading cases onto his cart and preparing to transport them to the refrigerated display case, he observed more inconsistencies that deepened his unease. Several boxes on the floor contained not grocery store supplies, but electronic equipment, coils of wire, what appeared to be radio components, and several items wrapped in brown paper that could have been anything. A filing cabinet in the corner stood open, and Raymond glimpsed what looked like documents with text in Cyrillic letters, though he couldn't read them from his position. The nephew, if that's what he really was, watched Raymond's every movement with an attention that felt oppressive. When Raymond moved toward the door leading to the main store, the man stepped between him and the doorway. "Use the front entrance," he said. "It is better for moving the cases." This made no practical sense. Raymond had been using the interior door for 8 months because it was the most efficient route. The front entrance would require him to wheel his cart around the entire building, adding unnecessary time and effort to the delivery. But something in the man's tone, in the way his body blocked the doorway, suggested that arguing would be unwise. Raymond complied, wheeling his cart back through the storage room and out the rear door. As he circled the building toward the front entrance, his mind catalogued everything he had observed. The ransacked storage room, the electronic equipment that had no obvious connection to a grocery store, the Cyrillic documents, the nephew who watched him, like a prison guard monitoring an inmate, Petrov's absence with only a vague explanation. Each detail individually might be innocent, but assembled together they formed a pattern that reminded Raymond of something he had seen years earlier. In 1975, when Raymond was working as a stock clerk at a Safeway supermarket before joining Coca-Cola, the FBI had arrested 2 men who had been using the store's loading dock to receive shipments that contained more than groceries. The investigation revealed that the men were part of a smuggling operation bringing electronic components to the Soviet Union through a network of front businesses. Raymond remembered the FBI agents explaining to store employees how to recognize suspicious activity, how seemingly legitimate businesses could serve as cover for intelligence operations, and how ordinary citizens were often the first to notice inconsistencies that trained investigators might miss because they weren't present during the daily routines that established normalcy. Raymond completed his delivery through the front entrance, restocking the display case while the nephew watched from behind the counter. When it came time to collect payment, the man counted out cash from the register, but Raymond noticed that his hands trembled slightly, and he miscounted twice before getting the correct amount. This was not the behavior of someone comfortable with his surroundings or confident in his cover story. As Raymond prepared to leave, he made a decision. "Thank you," he said to the man. "Please tell Mr. Petrov I hope he feels better soon. I will check in on him when I deliver next week." The nephew's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "That will not be necessary. Mr. Petrov is returning to the old country for family matters. The store may be closed for some time." Raymond nodded, as though this explanation made perfect sense, though alarm bells were now ringing in his mind. Store owners did not suddenly close their businesses for indefinite periods without advance notice, especially not meticulous operators like Viktor Petrov, who ran their establishments with military precision. And what family matters would require returning to the Soviet Union, if that's where Petrov was from, in the middle of the Cold War, when travel between the superpowers remained complicated and heavily monitored? Raymond returned to his truck and continued his route, but he could not concentrate on his deliveries. His mind kept returning to the storage room, to the electronic equipment and Cyrillic documents, to the nephew who moved like someone trained in intelligence work. He thought about calling the police, but what would he report? That a store owner was absent, and his nephew seemed suspicious? That there was electronic equipment in a storage room and some papers in a foreign language? None of this constituted evidence of criminal activity. But Raymond also thought about the Cold War context in which all of this was occurring. The year 1982 marked one of the tensest periods in U.S.-Soviet relations since the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Reagan had taken an aggressively anti-communist stance, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire and dramatically increasing defense spending. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan 3 years earlier and showed no signs of withdrawing. Tensions over nuclear weapons deployments in Europe had brought both sides to the brink of confrontation. In this environment, Soviet intelligence operations on American soil were not just possible, they were expected and ongoing. Raymond finished his morning deliveries and returned to the Coca-Cola distribution warehouse in Springfield. He unloaded his empty cases, completed his paperwork, and spent his lunch break sitting in his truck, debating what to do. His supervisor, a gruff former Navy man named Bill Hutchinson, had mentioned once that his son-in-law worked for the FBI. Raymond wondered if this connection might provide a way to report his concerns without going through official channels that might dismiss him as a paranoid citizen seeing spies where none existed. He found Bill in the warehouse office, reviewing delivery schedules for the following week. "Bill," Raymond said, "do you remember mentioning that your son-in-law works for the FBI?" Bill looked up from his paperwork, his weathered face creasing with curiosity. "Yeah, Mike. He's in the Washington field office." "Why?" Raymond took a breath and explained what he had witnessed at Petrov's market that morning. As he spoke, he watched Bill's expression shift from casual interest to serious attention. The older man set down his clipboard and listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific details. When Raymond finished, Bill was quiet for a moment. "Ray," he said finally. This could be nothing. But it could also be something, and Mike has told me before that the Bureau would rather investigate 100 false leads than miss one real threat. Let me call him. You should talk to him directly. Within an hour, Raymond was sitting in a coffee shop near the warehouse, waiting for Special Agent Michael Torres to arrive. Torres was younger than Raymond expected, perhaps 30, with dark hair and sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of Raymond's appearance and demeanor. He ordered coffee for both of them and produced a small notebook from his jacket pocket. "Mr. Cole," Torres said, "my father-in-law tells me you observed something unusual during a delivery this morning. I'd like you to walk me through everything you saw, every detail you can remember, no matter how insignificant it might seem." Raymond described the scene at Petrov's market, the nephew's suspicious behavior, the ransacked storage room, the electronic equipment, the Cyrillic documents. Torres took extensive notes, occasionally asking Raymond to clarify specific observations or expand on particular details. When Raymond finished, Torres closed his notebook and studied him with an expression that mixed professional assessment with something that might have been concern. "Mr. Cole," Torres said carefully, "what you're describing matches a pattern we've been tracking for several months. I can't give you specifics because this involves an ongoing investigation, but I can tell you that your observations may be more significant than you realize. I need to ask you some questions about Viktor Petrov. How long have you been delivering to his store?" 8 months, Raymond replied. "Since January of this year. And what can you tell me about him? His behavior, his customers, anything unusual you might have noticed?" Raymond thought back over the months of deliveries. Petrov was always very punctual, very organized. He paid in cash, always exact change. He never had much foot traffic, which seemed strange for a grocery store in that location. I would see the same few people come in, usually older men, also with accents. They would buy small items, cigarettes or newspapers, but they would talk to Petrov for a long time. Longer than you would expect for a simple transaction. Did you ever see any of these men carrying anything unusual? Briefcases, packages, anything that seemed out of place in a grocery store? Raymond tried to recall. "Now that you mention it, yes. There was one man, probably in his 40s, always wore a suit even though he came in early morning. He carried a leather briefcase and would go into the back room with Petrov. They would be back there for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. I always thought maybe the man was a supplier or distributor, but he never unloaded any inventory." Torres wrote quickly in his notebook. "Can you describe this man?" Raymond provided what details he could remember. Physical appearance, approximate age, the fact that he drove a dark blue sedan that he always parked 2 blocks away, rather than directly in front of the store. As he described these observations, Raymond realized he had been accumulating intelligence without knowing it, his daily routine and attention to pattern creating a baseline that made anomalies stand out. Torres asked several more questions about Petrov's market, about the nephew who had been present that morning, about the electronic equipment Raymond had glimpsed. Finally, he closed his notebook and looked at Raymond with an expression of professional gratitude mixed with caution. "Mr. Cole, you've provided valuable information. What I'm going to tell you now needs to remain completely confidential. Can I trust that you won't discuss this with anyone, including your wife or co-workers?" Raymond nodded. "You can trust me. We believe Viktor Petrov is not actually a grocery store owner. We believe he's a Soviet intelligence officer operating under commercial cover. The store is a front for espionage activities, specifically for receiving and transmitting classified information stolen from government sources. Your delivery this morning may have interrupted an operation in progress, which could explain why the storage room was in disarray and why Petrov was absent. The man you met was likely another operative trying to secure materials before evacuating the location. Raymond felt his stomach tighten. So, I walked right into the middle of an active spy operation. Torres nodded. Yes, but you also provided us with crucial information. We've been watching Petrov for 6 weeks, but we haven't had sufficient cause to obtain a search warrant. Now we do. A civilian witness observing suspicious materials and behavior during legitimate business activities gives us the legal foundation we need to act. Am I in danger? Raymond asked. Did that man, the nephew, suspect that I would report what I saw? Torres considered this carefully. He may have suspected you noticed something unusual, but he had no reason to think you would understand the significance or that you would contact law enforcement. Most people would simply continue with their deliveries and forget about it. The fact that you recognized the pattern as suspicious and took action shows exceptional awareness. But to answer your question directly, we don't believe you're in immediate danger. These operatives are trained to avoid attracting attention, and harming a civilian delivery driver would do exactly that. However, I'm going to recommend that you avoid making deliveries to that location for the next several weeks. We'll provide your company with a plausible reason for temporarily removing it from your route. Over the following days, Raymond tried to maintain his normal routine, but his mind kept returning to Petrov's market and the realization that he had been delivering Coca-Cola to a Soviet spy operation for 8 months. He wondered what intelligence had been passing through that innocuous-looking grocery store while he restocked refrigerator shelves with soft drinks. He thought about the man in the suit with the leather briefcase, about the older customers who spent too long talking to Petrov, about all the small details he had noticed but not understood at the time. 10 days after Raymond's meeting with Agent Torres, the FBI executed a search warrant on Petrov's market. Raymond learned about the raid from the evening news, which showed footage of federal agents carrying boxes of evidence from the store while a small crowd of neighborhood residents watched with expressions ranging from shock to curiosity. The news report described the operation as part of a broader investigation into Soviet intelligence activities, but provided few specifics about what had been discovered or who had been arrested. Agent Torres called Raymond the following morning and asked if he could meet for another conversation. They returned to the same coffee shop, and this time Torres brought a senior agent, a woman in her 50s, who introduced herself as Special Agent Sarah Chen. She thanked Raymond for his cooperation and explained that they wanted to brief him on what the raid had uncovered. "Mr. Cole," Agent Chen said, "the search of Petrov's market revealed extensive evidence of espionage activities. We found shortwave radio equipment capable of transmitting encrypted messages to Moscow. We recovered documents containing classified information about American military capabilities and strategic planning. We discovered a sophisticated photography setup for producing microfilm. Most significantly, we found a list of sources, individuals working in government agencies and defense contractors who were providing classified information to Soviet intelligence." Raymond absorbed this information with growing astonishment. "And Viktor Petrov? He's disappeared," Torres said. "We believe he was warned somehow that we were closing in and managed to escape, probably to the Soviet embassy, where he would have diplomatic immunity. We're still investigating how he was tipped off. But the nephew you encountered, we identified him as Dmitry Volkov, another GRU officer. He was arrested at Dulles Airport, attempting to board a flight to Mexico City. He's currently in federal custody facing espionage charges." Agent Chen continued, "Your observations provided the breakthrough we needed. We had been monitoring Petrov for weeks, but he was extremely careful, varying his patterns and maintaining excellent operational security. Your report about the ransacked storage room and the suspicious equipment gave us probable cause for the search warrant. More importantly, your detailed observations about the man with the briefcase and the unusual customer patterns helped us identify several other individuals involved in the operation. Raymond felt a strange mixture of pride and unease. How many people were involved? Including Petrov and Volkov, we've identified at least 7 individuals directly participating in the espionage network, Chen said. 3 of them are Soviet intelligence officers operating under various covers. The other 4 are American citizens who were recruited to provide classified information in exchange for money. The network had been active for at least 3 years, systematically gathering intelligence about U.S. military technology and strategic planning. What kind of information were they stealing? Raymond asked. Chen exchanged a glance with Torres before responding. Details about satellite reconnaissance systems, information about submarine detection capabilities, data on strategic defense initiatives, the kind of intelligence that could significantly compromise American military advantages if it reached Moscow. Your delivery interruption may have prevented the transmission of particularly sensitive material. We found documents in the storage room that had been prepared for microfilming but hadn't been processed yet. If Volkov had completed that task before you arrived, that information would have been transmitted to Soviet intelligence, and we might never have recovered it. Over the next several months, Raymond learned more about the operation through a combination of news reports, conversations with Agent Torres, and testimony he was asked to provide to a closed grand jury. The case expanded beyond Petrov's market to encompass a broader network of Soviet intelligence operations in the Washington area. The information recovered during the raid led to the identification of additional operatives and the disruption of several other espionage activities. The trial of Dmitry Volkov took place in federal court the following spring. Raymond was called as a witness to describe his observations during the delivery on that August morning. The experience of testifying was surreal. Sitting in a courtroom while lawyers questioned him about deliveries and display cases, and a suspicious nephew who turned out to be a Soviet intelligence officer. Volkov sat at the defense table, his expression carefully neutral, showing no emotion as Raymond recounted the details of their encounter. The prosecution used Raymond's testimony to establish that Volkov had been present at a location containing espionage equipment and classified documents. Combined with other evidence recovered during the raid and additional testimony from FBI agents who had conducted surveillance, the case against Volkov was overwhelming. He was convicted on multiple counts of espionage and conspiracy and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, though Raymond later learned that Volkov was exchanged for an American agent held by the Soviets less than 3 years into his sentence. Viktor Petrov was never apprehended. The FBI believed he had made it to the Soviet embassy and was eventually smuggled out of the country, probably in a diplomatic vehicle that could not be searched without creating an international incident. He returned to Moscow, where his fate remained unknown. Some intelligence analysts speculated that he had been celebrated as a successful operative who managed to escape capture. Others suggested that his network's exposure might have resulted in reprimands or punishment for operational failures. For Raymond Cole, life gradually returned to normal, though he carried the knowledge of his involvement in the case like a weight he couldn't quite set down. The Coca-Cola company had been briefed by the FBI about Raymond's role, though details remained classified. His supervisor, Bill Hutchinson, treated him with a new respect, and Raymond received a commendation letter from the FBI director thanking him for his contribution to national security. The letter was classified and could not be shown to anyone, but Raymond kept it in a safe deposit box alongside his military discharge papers from a 2-year Army stint he had served in the early 1970s. His wife, Linda, knew something significant had happened, but Raymond's non-disclosure agreement prevented him from sharing details. He told her only that he had witnessed something suspicious during a delivery and reported it to authorities, and that it had turned out to be important. Linda, who understood her husband's nature, did not press for information he could not provide. She simply told him she was proud of him for doing the right thing. Raymond's route was eventually restructured, and he never delivered to the location that had housed Petrov's market again. The store remained closed for several months, its windows covered with brown paper, while FBI investigators continued their work. Eventually, it was rented to a Vietnamese family who opened a small restaurant specializing in pho and other traditional dishes. Raymond would sometimes drive past and see customers enjoying their meals, ordinary people living ordinary lives in a space that had once served as a front for espionage operations. The experience changed Raymond in subtle ways. He found himself paying closer attention to his deliveries, noticing details about locations and customers that he might have previously overlooked. He became more aware of the hidden infrastructure of the Cold War that existed beneath the surface of American society, the intelligence operations and counterintelligence efforts that most citizens never saw. He understood now that the conflict between the United States and Soviet Union was not just fought in distant locations or through diplomatic channels, but also in grocery stores and office buildings and suburban neighborhoods where ordinary people lived and worked. Agent Torres stayed in occasional contact with Raymond, calling every few months to check in and sometimes sharing carefully curated information about cases related to the Petrov investigation. Through these conversations, Raymond learned that the network he had helped expose was part of a broader Soviet intelligence effort that had been ongoing since the late 1970s. The KGB and GRU had placed numerous operatives throughout the United States, using commercial covers and false identities to build intelligence networks that systematically gathered classified information. What made the Petrov case particularly significant, Torres explained during one of their conversations, was that it demonstrated how vulnerable even small, seemingly insignificant businesses could be to exploitation as intelligence fronts. Petrov had chosen a grocery store precisely because it was unremarkable, because it generated enough legitimate traffic to disguise clandestine meetings, and because delivery drivers and suppliers provided natural cover for the movement of materials and information. "Your job made you the perfect witness," Torres said. "You were present at routine times, you understood the normal patterns of the business, and you had the awareness to recognize when something was out of place." That combination of access, familiarity, and observation is exactly what intelligence agencies try to prevent, which is why Petrov's operation was so carefully compartmented. But he couldn't account for someone like you, someone who simply paid attention and trusted their instincts. In the years that followed, Raymond continued working for Coca-Cola, eventually being promoted to route supervisor and later to a position in the company's distribution planning department. He never forgot that August morning when a routine delivery became something far more significant. The experience had taught him that ordinary citizens could play extraordinary roles in national security, not through dramatic action or heroic intervention, but through simple awareness and the courage to report suspicious activity to proper authorities. The Cold War ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and with it came a gradual declassification of intelligence operations that had been conducted during the conflict. Raymond read with interest about other espionage cases that had been resolved through civilian observations, about networks that had been disrupted because someone noticed an inconsistency and chose to act. Each story reinforced what he had learned through his own experience, that security depended not just on professional intelligence agencies, but on the collective vigilance of ordinary people going about their daily lives. On a warm afternoon in 2008, Raymond received a phone call from a researcher working on a book about Cold War espionage in the Washington area. The researcher had obtained declassified FBI files about the Petrov case through Freedom of Information Act requests and wanted to interview Raymond about his role. Raymond agreed, curious to learn what had remained classified for so many years. The interview took place at Raymond's home, where he had retired several years earlier. The researcher, a young historian named David Klein, brought copies of the declassified documents and walked Raymond through the full scope of the operation he had helped disrupt. Raymond learned for the first time that the intelligence Petrov's network had been gathering included information about American communication satellite systems, data that could have given the Soviets significant advantages in intercepting military communications. The documents Raymond had glimpsed in the storage room that August morning had been preliminary reports on satellite ground station locations and signal frequencies, intelligence that was being prepared for transmission to Moscow when the operation was interrupted. "Mr. Cole," Klein said as they reviewed the documents, "the FBI's assessment is that your intervention prevented the transmission of intelligence that could have seriously compromised American communication security. The network you helped expose had been gathering this information for more than 2 years, waiting for the right moment to transmit it without detection. Your observations forced them to attempt an emergency evacuation of materials, which led to mistakes that allowed the FBI to secure evidence they might not have otherwise obtained." Raymond looked at the documents. Spread across his dining room table, official FBI reports and photographs of equipment and people, the bureaucratic record of an event that had shaped his understanding of his own country and his role as a citizen. He thought about all the deliveries he had made over the years, the thousands of interactions with store owners and managers, the accumulated knowledge of routes and schedules and patterns. He had been doing his job that August morning, nothing more, but his job had placed him in a position to recognize something wrong and to take action. The story Klein eventually published included a chapter about the Petrov case, though Raymond's name was changed and identifying details were modified to protect his privacy. The book described how a beverage delivery driver had noticed suspicious activity at a grocery store and reported it to the FBI, leading to the disruption of a significant Soviet intelligence network. It was a small chapter in a larger book about Cold War espionage, but it captured an essential truth about how intelligence wars were actually fought. Not through dramatic confrontations or elaborate operations, but through the accumulation of small observations made by people who were simply paying attention. Raymond Cole died in 2015 at the age of 67. His contribution to American security known to only a handful of people. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his long career with Coca-Cola, his volunteer work with a veterans organization, and his devotion to his family. It did not mention that he had helped disrupt a Soviet spy network, or that his observations had prevented the compromise of sensitive military intelligence. That knowledge remained classified in files that might not be fully released for decades to come. But among those who did know, Raymond Cole was remembered as an example of something that intelligence professionals understood, but civilians often underestimated. That security depends on vigilance at every level of society. That threats can hide in the most ordinary places. That the courage to trust one's instincts and report suspicious activity is as important as any sophisticated surveillance technology or elaborate investigation. Raymond had been a Coca-Cola delivery driver who happened to notice something wrong and chose to do something about it. In the complex machinery of Cold War intelligence, that simple act of awareness and responsibility had mattered more than he would ever fully understand. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.